Então, boa tarde mais uma vez a todo mundo. Good afternoon to everyone. So, we are happy to have our last event on the Semana Franco-Uspiana here at DB, and we have the pleasure to receive Laurent Loison from the Sphère Laboratoire at the National Center for Scientific Research in France. And as you know, most of you, I think you were there on Tuesday and Wednesday. We had this huge event, so we should just give again thanks to the Alcani and the French Consulate in São Paulo and the CNRS team here at USP who made the infrastructure this possible, and of course also the Institute of Bioscience. So Laurent just published it, it means on July, so 2 months ago, a book on Canguilhem, called Canguilhem, Philosophe de Vital, Lire la connaissance de la vie, so well, I'm not going to translate this, the philosophy of what is living, right, and own a specific book of Canguilhem, and this is what he's going to present us, so it's a really recent book. A book that came to Brazil, it arrived on Friday in Brazil for the first time with Laurent. It arrived to Pedro Paulo on Tuesday, and it was read until now today. So thank you really much to Pedro Paulo from the philosophy department. It's nice to take to people. It's still possible to read a book and to read it in 3 days. That's quite amazing.
Well written and it's very interesting, so it was easy.
Thank you a lot, Pedro Paulo, for the efforts to having this on this short time, right? So Laurent will make an exposition of until 45 minutes of the content of the book. Then, as you prefer, Pedro Paulo, you can be here or there, as you prefer.
I'm going to be standing.
Yes.
So I'll sit there because otherwise it's going to be awkward.
And then when Laurent finishes, Pedro Paulo will make a debate, will make comments and a narration on the book. And then, of course, we will open to comments and discussion. So thank you very much again, Laurent.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the sponsors, and especially a big thanks to Joao again and to Pedro Paulo. It was really a pleasure to be with you this entire week. So maybe just a follow-up on the history of this book, because Canguilhem became part of the national program for what we have in France as class préparatoire for engineer schools. And he will enter the program this year and the year after that. So in late April, I was asked by the traditional publisher of Canguilhem to write a book on knowledge of life, and my challenge was to have it written for mid-June. So I had only 6 weeks to write the book, and it was published in early July, so this never happens in French. To have a book that started to be thought of in early May, and 2 months after that, it was already published and available in bookshops. So this might explain why I don't quote many other colleagues in the book. It was because I have to be very efficient and to focus on the writing during the few weeks that I had at my disposal. Okay, this being said, so for me it's not always easy to know how much is known about Canguilhem in foreign countries. And for instance, in the US and in the UK, Canguilhem is still today not very well known, but I suppose that in Brazil things are different. In France, it's a bit awkward because Canguilhem was and still is at the same time very famous for some reasons. For instance, his connection with Michel Foucault, because Canguilhem was the president of the PhD defense of Michel Foucault doctoral dissertation. And he succeeded Gaston Bachelard at the direction of the EHPSC in the very center of Paris. So this is the historical building, and it is written here that you can see Faculté de Paris. This picture was taken last week, with a lot of sun in Paris, which is sometimes unusual. And this is the EHPSC, the second floor, traditionally. but I guess for about 6 years now, the HPSC is also at the 3rd floor. So this is a very famous place in Paris. But it might also be maybe the most ancient laboratory in the world devoted to history and philosophy of science. Because it was created before Bachelard, it was created in the early 30s, and the first director was Abel, completely unknown nowadays. So Canguilhem is both very famous, but also not that well known, even in France. And 20 years ago, when I was a PhD student, and when I said that I was very interested in Canguilhem's philosophy of biology or biological philosophy, usually I was met with a huge skepticism by many colleagues who thought that Canguilhem was completely uninteresting because he would have had a very how to put it, a very simplistic understanding of what is the history of science. So things are changing now, thanks to, I guess, 2 events. First, his archives are now available since 2008 in the cafes at the EMS, so very close to the HPST, the 5th arrondissement de Paris. And because of that, there is a significant movement of rediscovery of the philosophy of Georges Canguilhem. And this movement of reconsideration culminates, so to speak, with the publication of his Œuvre complète. And the last volume, the 6th volume, was published a week before my small book on knowledge of life. To give you just an idea, this volume is almost 1,000 pages long. So we have a lot of new material to understand what was his philosophy and what were his ideas, because during decades, Canguilhem was known to have published only very few things, mostly the normal and pathological, his medical dissertation, which was defended in 1943, and a few edited volumes that gather some of his articles, 3 edited volumes, and one of these volumes is Knowledge of Life. So I was asked to have a book that could be understandable for students about knowledge of life, because Canguilhem, even for French speakers, French readers, is very, very difficult to understand. I guess I was in a good position to do that because I had no training in philosophy. My training was in biology. I had full training in biology, and then I turned to history of science. So basically, 20 years ago, I knew nothing about philosophy. So in a sense, I was in a position like a student just after the baccalaureate, who is trying to understand what is the content of this very difficult book. And the other reason, so maybe sometimes I may have missed some philosophical context about what Canguilhem was, what he wanted to say. But in the other end, because of my training in biology and because of what I know about the history of biology, I know a lot about the biological context in which Canguilhem tried to develop his biological philosophy. So I guess the most important part of this book is to make explicit not the philosophical context, but the biological context of his philosophy. Okay, the title of my talk today is in direct connection with this book published in 1994, A Vital Rationalist, selected writings from Georges Canguilhem, edited by François de Laporte, with a very, very informative introduction by American economic anthropologist Paul Rabineau. And the title of the introduction is also A Vital Rationalist. So I don't know who between François de Laporte and Paul Rabineau proposed this title, but I think it's a very good title to encapsulate the research project of Georges Canguilhem, but nowhere in the book the title is explained and justified. And the introduction is very good, but there is absolutely no justification of why this title, A now rationalist. So the topic of my talk this afternoon is to try to justify this title. Okay, so first thing to notice and to emphasize is that Canguilhem was not satisfied with classical Cartesian mechanism and at the same time with Bergson's philosophy of the vitality of living things. So this is quite well known, but nevertheless I have to start with that. So mechanicism was a very strong commitment of French science and French natural philosophy during centuries, from Descartes onwards, for instance with Jules of Canguilhem, who was a very strong Cartesian in the 18th century, and he published his very famous book, L'Homme Machine. And at the beginning of the 20th century, mechanicism was a very strong orientation of biology. And for instance, Jacques Loeb, he was a German physiologist who came to the US, and during the second part of his life, he was based in the US. And in the early 20th century, he published many very well-known books that were, so to speak, some kind of endorsement of this very strong Cartesian mechanism. For instance, this one, the mechanistic conception of life. These books were very famous. Some of them were translated into French, and we know that Canguilhem read these books very early because, thanks to the work of Camille Limoges and now Pierre-Olivier Rito, in connection with the edition of the Œuvre Complète, we have the titles of all the books that Canguilhem read when he was himself a student at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So, among these books were some of Jacques Loeb. So Canguilhem was very early aware of this very strong mechanical understanding of life. And for people like Jacques Loeb, the idea is that all we know about the specificities of living beings could be, at some point, reduced to classical, physical, and chemical knowledge of the time. Another example that was known also by Canguilhem and was discussed in his very famous chapter about the milieu in the knowledge of life was the work of the French biologist Frédéric Housset. Frédéric Housset had a very strong also mechanistic research program, and for instance he thought that the morphology of fishes could be entirely reduced to physical constraint because of the water that was the traditional environment of fishes. And he developed his ideas, very physical ideas in this book, for instance, form, power and stability of fishes, that was published in the early 20th century. And that again was very known because Housset was professor of zoology at the Sorbonne, so he was a big name in French academia. And Canguilhem was aware of this possibility of a very strong mechanism. And just for the record, a student of mine published a few weeks before this book, a book devoted to the work of Frédéric Housset. A very, very good work. This is his master dissertation, and it very quickly became a book. So, in this view, mechanical science will, if you compare what we know about the inanimate world thanks to mechanical science, and on the other hand, if you have what is life at some point, it is thought that very classically, because of the progress of science, sooner or later, mechanical science will encompass the entirety of what has to be known about life. So, nothing new under the sun about this. But in opposition to mechanical science, this again is very known, Henri Bergson developed a completely new philosophy of biology, especially his bestseller book, Creative Evolution, first published in French in 1907. And as you well known, he was very critical both against mechanism or mechanicism, but also against finalism. And he tried to develop what would be a third way, his philosophy of the vital impulse, élan vital, which is not really vitalism. Usually it is understood as a new form of vitalism, but it's much more complicated than that. And Bergson did not think of the vital impulse as a physical entity, as something material. He thought that scientific intelligence could not be applied to the understanding of living beings, and that we have to go into another kind of faculty that he termed intuition. So it's not really like a vital force according to what was a vital force for people like, for example, Xavier Bichat at the beginning of the 19th century. So for Bergson, you have mechanical science, and mechanical science could give some knowledge about life, but only a very small part of life could be understood with the help of mechanical science. And to have some knowledge about what is not taken into account by mechanical science, we have to use not scientific intelligence, but something different that's called very enigmatically intuition. Okay, so Canguilhem was not satisfied neither by Descartes and by Bergson. And his project that he started to elaborate in the early 40s, when he was a medical student at the Strasbourg faculty. But at that time, Strasbourg faculty was not in Strasbourg because of the Nazis. It was in Clermont-Ferrand, so hundreds of kilometers away, so it's a bit complicated. And the strength of the Strasbourg faculty was that during centuries, it was in between German culture and French culture. So it was a very dynamic place to perform medical studies. And Georges Canguilhem, he started his medical studies not in Strasbourg, but in Toulouse, in the south of France, when he was a teacher of philosophy. And then, because of some reasons, but I'm not going into details, he moved from Toulouse to Strasbourg, and in Strasbourg he met with very, very clever people, and very impressive biologists and medical physicists. And this was the turning point of his philosophical research program, and normal and pathological could not have been elaborated in Toulouse. Canguilhem needed at some point this very fruitful contact with his colleagues in Strasbourg, in Clermont-Ferrand. So it was a complication, but it was the fault of the Nazis. Okay, so the idea of Canguilhem was that, okay, we have mechanical science, we have life, it's very difficult to apply straightforward mechanical concepts to life. If we do that, we are losing a huge part of the specificity of living beings. So the idea of Canguilhem is that a science of life is possible. So it was proposed to Bergson research program. But this biological science should be able, in one way or another, to take into account the specificity of living beings. So this is very clear, if Canguilhem is clear. This is very, very clear in the introduction of Knowledge of Life, a text that is entitled Thought and the Living, in reference to one of Bergson's books that Canguilhem read in the early 30s. And for Canguilhem, it was also something very important in his own path. And he said that we believe that reasonable rationalism must recognize its limits and integrate its condition of exercise. So he was a rationalist. Intelligence can only be applied to life, but it can be applied in opposition to Bergson by recognizing the originality of life. The thinking of the living must take from the living the idea of the living. So I don't know how it sounds in English. It's very difficult to translate Canguilhem, but the French, again, Canguilhem really enjoy to make these kind of sentences. And sometimes it's really hard to go really into his own ideas. So Neither Descartes nor Bergson, and we have to pay attention for biology to be a science that is able to take into account the specificity of its object, the vitality of life. How to do that? Second part of my talk, the condition for the possibility of the knowledge of life. Well, Canguilhem, in many cases, he emphasized that for biology to exist, this science needs strictly biological concept proprement biologique. So, what was the concept proprement biologique? He kept repeating that again and again in Knowledge of Life and also in other texts and other books. He gave examples of that. For instance, in Knowledge of Life, where he compared the old concept of blood irrigation and the new concept at the scale of the history of science, of course, the new concept of blood circulation. And for Canguilhem, this was a strictly biological concept. Why? Because it respects the irreducible individuality of living bodies. So the most fundamental facts about life for Canguilhem is that life, and this is not the case in physics or chemistry, the phenomenon of life exists only as far as there are individuals on Earth. It's always at the level of individuals that life exists. So, in one way or another, biology needs absolutely to take this into account. Biology must therefore consider living beings as significant entities and individuality not as an object, but as a characteristic in the order of values. To live is to radiate, to organize the environment from a center of reference that cannot itself be referred to without losing its original meaning. So this is, for Canguilhem, the philosophical definition of what is an individual. And according to Canguilhem, biology, to be a real science of life, or the vitality of life, need to start from there. So he opposed every concept, scientific concepts, that could not, in some way or another, be related to this intuition about what is a living being. And this he developed in Knowledge of Life in the chapter entitled Life and its Environment. The French title is Le Vivant et son milieu. Very difficult to encapsulate the specific meaning in an English translation. Okay, another example that was very important for Canguilhem was his dialogue with French physiologist Claude Bernard. So maybe this was the most important biological reference for Canguilhem from the early 30s until the very end. For instance, in 1966, he published a reissue of the last book of Claude Bernard, Lessons on Phenomena of Life, that are common to both animals and plants, with a new preface by Georges Canguilhem. And again, the publisher was Canguilhem's publisher in Paris. If you don't know Paris and the neighborhood of the Sorbonne, it's very unique because Vrins is 10 meters away from the Sorbonne. And it is the only publisher, I guess, in the world who is entirely devoted only to philosophy. So it's really important in French culture. It's a very famous academic publisher. So Claude Bernard, in a sense, tried to develop the concept proprement biologique. And an example of that, a very famous one, was this concept of le milieu intérieur, the internal milieu, which was something in between what is the classical physical environment and the vital phenomena that are formed within cells of the organism. And this kind of concept for Canguilhem was exactly a biological concept because it could not be reduced only to mechanical science, but of course it is in connection with mechanical science. And thanks to this concept, Claude Bernard was able to perform experiments with animals, many experiments, and to interpret their meanings. And according to Canguilhem, in my view, is fully correct, this concept fully takes into account the fact that vital phenomena took place within organisms that are individual entities. And an organism is, by definition, an entity, a complex entity with an internal milieu. So this is why one of the reasons why Canguilhem was especially interested in Claude Bernard biology, and for instance, to give you a standard of reference. If you read the normal and the pathological, you will find many connections and many quotations of Claude Bernard, but you won't find any reference to Louis Pasteur, because Louis Pasteur, he was trained as a chemist, and he was not at all interested in the individuality of living beings. So for Canguilhem, it was a completely irrelevant reference, and it was only François d'Agonis, one of the most famous students of Canguilhem, that started to be interested in Pasteur microbiology. But this was not the case for Canguilhem, and this absence of Louis Pasteur, which was, of course, one of the main scientific heroes in French culture, I think is very telling about the interests of Georges Canguilhem. Okay, a third example of a concept proprement biologique could be found at the very center of his very famous book, The Normal and the Pathological. So this was his PhD in medicine. It was defended, published in 1943 in very difficult material conditions, obviously. And after that, Canguilhem never stopped thinking about the connection between the normal and the pathological. And a new and definitive version of the book with new chapters was eventually published in 1965. So 22 years after the original defense. Okay, and I don't have time to go into the detail of his argument in this very stimulating book, but also very difficult and very elusive, because Canguilhem's books are very small, because he wanted them to be small. But the language is very dense, and the contraction of the ideas is just incredible. So, in a sense, my job in that book was to say, okay, when Canguilhem is saying that, now we need 2 pages to explain what he really wants to say in just one sentence. So, it's very dense. His central argument about normality and abnormality is, in a sense, rooted in another biological concept, the one of natural selection. And this is, for the most, completely unusual, because in the 40s, almost no French biologists thought that natural selection was important. Because of Lamarckism and Lamarck, most French biologists thought that Darwin was completely wrong, and that maybe natural selection could be responsible for a small part of the evolutionary process, but natural selection was not at all important in French biology. And most French philosophers knew nothing about natural selection or Darwinism. So, in this respect, also Canguilhem was a complete anomaly in French academia. So, to him, natural selection was the ultimate authority that distinguishes between normal and pathological. His huge philosophical thesis in that book is that there is no quantitative relationship between the normal and the pathological. The pathological is not something that could be said to be in quantitative relationship with the normal, with just a quantitative variation. To him, the pathological was something different, ontologically different from the normal. And he thought that, in a sense, natural selection was the guarantee of his argument, because the variation is normal or pathological only in connection to a specific individual and in a specific environment. So you cannot have a quantitative general statement about what is absolutely and always normal and what is absolutely and always pathological. It really depends on the specific relation between a single organism and its specific environment. In other words, it is only a relational property and it could not be a quantitative property. And it bases its argument on the concept of natural selection. So this is very surprising for the reason that I just reminded. How did he arrive to a good understanding of the process of natural selection in a world entirely dominated by Lamarckians? And he was connected, not necessarily directly, although it might be the case with Philippe Leritier, to the only two Darwinians in France at that time, only two, in Paris. Well, in Paris for Georges Tessier, both of them were trained as mathematicians in the UNS, and Georges Tessier very quickly became a professor in the Sorbonne. But Philippe Leritier was younger, and when he came back to the US, he had first to occupy a position in Strasbourg, in Clermont-Ferrand. So it might be the case that Canguilhem and Leritier knew each other directly, but we don't have archives to grant this possibility. So it might be direct, it might be not that direct, but in any case, we know that Canguilhem was aware of some works performed by Tessier and Leritier on Drosophila melanogaster, the standard model organism for geneticists and evolutionary biologists. When Leritier came back to the US, when he was trained as a geneticist, he devised a new experimental object, a population cage, in order to be able to have hundreds and even thousands of flies raised in the same environment that could be very, very strongly experimentally controlled. And thanks to this new device, both of them were able to test some of the mathematical models of population genetics. Because you know population genetics, the new form of Darwinism, was developed in the 20s and 30s, but during years, only theoretically, with no possibility of application. And one of the very first possibility of experimental control of the models of population genetics was this one, with this apparatus and using Drosophila melanogaster. And one of them, of their experiments, was performed on the roof of the Roscoff Zoological Station in French Brittany, a very important place to perform biology in the French system. This station was created just after the war against the Prussians, because you know in 1870, France was very quickly overcome by the Prussian army, so it was a very, very huge defeat. And for most French people, it was a complete delusion because French people still at that time thought of their greatness that they cannot be defeated, and it was just a matter of days before they were defeated. So, because of that, French scientists wanted to redevelop French science, and one consequence of this new movement was the creation of marine station, and this one, which was part of the Sorbonne, was created in 1872. And the former director of the station was Georges Tessier. So in the late 30s of the 20th century, in 1937, they performed with this population cage an experiment on the roof, and what they did was simply to have thousands of Drosophila and to open the boxes. So because of the wind, there was a form of natural selection that positively selected wingless Drosophila, despite the fact that wingless Drosophila usually do not survive because their vitality is less than the average phenotype. So this shows that normality or abnormality is a matter of context. Wingless Drosophila usually would not survive, but in this specific environment, its fitness become superior to the average phenotype of the population. For instance, this is one of the arguments that Canguilhem developed in the normal and the pathological. So this is the place on the roof where these very famous experiments were performed in 1937. Roscoff is a very old traditional village in French Brittany, so it's very funny because you have a very huge scientific neighborhood lost into a very traditional Britain village, but now there are a lot of tourists there. Okay, for biology to exist, it is needed that scientific concepts are truly biological concepts in the sense that I just developed. This is an epistemological thesis by Canguilhem. But there is something more profound, in a sense, in his philosophy, his biological philosophy. Something not about epistemology, but something about ontology, about the ontological connection between life and knowledge. And I will end with that. So, this is already the case in this book, Knowledge of Life. The first edition was in 1952, but with one chapter that was missing. And the definitive edition of the book was in 1965, already in brun, this one. But Canguilhem reflection about the connection between knowledge of life of course, did not stop with this book. It went on during years, and basically, Canguilhem is one of his main ideas was to record knowledge and life. For instance, in 1966, he was invited in Belgium to give a talk, and the title of his talk, it is written very small here, was The Concept et la Vie. Concept of life, and because Canguilhem loved to do play word, we can do one. We thought of the idea that the concept is life. Okay, so the title of the talk is the concept on life, on the living, but we can say that his idea beyond this title was the concept is life. Why was that? Because it could seem very strange to us, but at that time, in the mid-60s, Canguilhem became interested in the new developments of a new science, namely molecular biology. He was not a good specialist of molecular biology. He ignored many technical issues, and he did not understand well what was at the center of molecular biology, but in a sense, he knew that a new science was emerging because of the work of François Jacob and Jacques Rouleau at the Pasteur Institute. Because they were very famous because of the Nobel Prize in 1965. It was the first Nobel Prize in science for French people, I guess, since the early 30s. So there was a huge gap between the early 30s and the mid-60s. So because of that, Jacob and both were very famous. So Canguilhem knew that something was happening. And what he was especially interested in the fact that at the very core of molecular biology, a new understanding of the living was, in a sense, at work. And this new understanding was based on a conception of life that puts the emphasis of these kinds of formulation: genetic information, genetic code, transcription, translation, messenger RNA, etc., etc. So for Canguilhem, it seemed that the concept, something very conceptual, something very abstract, was already at the very basis of life. And because of that, for him, as strange as it can seem to us nowadays, this was the guarantee that life could be conceptually understood, because at the very core of life, there is already something conceptual that can be written in this kind of new alphabet. So again, for today, molecular biologists, it could seem very strange, but it was as completely false as it was the idea of Canguilhem. Why was that? Because at that time, molecular biologists themselves were, in a sense, very attracted by this possibility. And for instance, there was several discussions between François Jacob and linguists in order to understand if it makes sense to speak of genetic information, of translation, traduction, and all this, or are they just metaphoric terms in order to give an easier understanding of the experimental research. So it was a concern also for molecular biologists at that time, and not only for Canguilhem. Okay, so it's very strange, it's not very correct, but it is interesting for us because it emphasizes the key aspect of its biological philosophy. The fact that Canguilhem, since the early 30s until his death, was thinking about the possibility, the very possibility of a true scientific knowledge of life that would be in accordance with the vitality of living beings. And in the mid-60s, during a few years, he thought that molecular biology would be a way to answer this issue. So this is why he was very interested at that moment in the new developments, or at least part of them, of molecular biology. So this was just a very schematic account. If you are interested in this aspect of Canguilhem philosophy, I wrote a paper specifically devoted to that, published in French, I guess in 2018, in the Revue d'Histoire des Sciences, and this paper could be accessed very easily on the internet. Un enthousiasme paradoxal, Georges Canguilhem et la biologie moléculaire. Okay, so to conclude, why vital rationalist? Because against Bergson, Canguilhem thought that rationalism could still be a key to understand life, and this is, in a sense, anti-rational, but in opposition to René Descartes and to mechanism, he thought that this new rationalism could not be just a follow-up of mechanicism, and that this rationalism has to integrate the vitality of the living. And so Canguilhem was, in a sense, in between mechanicism and vitalism. If we want to put a word in that, Canguilhem was very close to organicist biologists that were contemporary of his work. For instance, he was very, in some respects, he was very close to what Conrad Wellington thought in the book approximately at the same time, even though I guess he never read Wellington. Canguilhem was very interested in German-speaking biology. He had not so much, was not so much connected with the English-speaking world. Okay, thank you very much again for your attention and your invitation. It was really a pleasure, and I'm happy to discuss that with you now. Thanks.
So thank you a lot, Laurent. And now we thank Pedro Paulo for his availability to comment.
Esse papo os colegas quiserem copiar.
Ah, ok. Isso passou, né? Esse aqui.
Se interessar, eu vou deixar para o João.
Ah, legal.
Eu não sei se tem PDF na internet. Não é óbvio.
Obrigado, Pedro Paulo.
Então depois você me fala.
So we will now hear Pedro Paulo speak on the subject, and then we can open for discussion.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting and broached on many points. So I would only ask for clarifications on some points which seem to me very, very important, and it would be nice to hear you about them. Well, the title of your book is Canguilhem, Philosophe Vital, Philosopher Vital, to read La Connaissance de la Vie, to read the knowledge of life. And you, as you have showed in one of your slides, the one on Claude Bernard, le livre sur les végétaux, oui. The notion of internal milieu. And could you explain some more of this notion, because it's very interesting. In a sense, it's at the heart of La Connaissance de la Vie. And
You mean
the idea of
for Claude Bernard or for Canguilhem? Really?
both of them.
Both of them. Okay. So for Claude Bernard, Claude Bernard was first trained in medicine, of course, under the guidance of François Magendie, who was one of the first to introduce experimental practices at the Collège de France with regard to physiology and medicine. So this was in the late 30s. But Claude Bernard never wanted to become a medical doctor. He wanted to be a scientist, and he had tremendous skills in vivisection, dissection, and in experimentation. And very, very quickly, he became the préparateur of Magendie at the Collège de France, and Magendie was stunned by the skills of his new student. So during years, Claude Bernard made very, very difficult experimental manipulation, and he was able to develop a completely new research program thanks to his manual skills, and he obtained a bunch of results during more than 10 years. And he worked at the laboratory every day for Christmas, 1st of January, during summer. And what was called the laboratory at that time, at the Collège de France, basically it was a basement with no windows. So you can imagine he was alone, no technicians. He found dogs in Paris, in the streets of Paris. He captured them, and then he took them in the laboratory, and he performed vivisection. So it was a very hard task. His marriage was a completely disaster. So he stayed in the lab, and in the end, after approximately 15 years of intense work, he became very sick. So he had to, for a time, to quit experimental science, and then he started to think, how can I interpret all that I have done during more than 10 years? And he developed a new concept, the concept of the milieu intérieur. And his idea is that you can have true experimentation with living beings, but in order to understand the causality of the processes, you need to perform vivisection in order to stabilize not the external environment, but the internal environment. Otherwise, if your variables are in the external environment, you won't be able to see, especially with mammals, how they could produce new effects. So basically, he had many results, and in order to fully interpret all the results he obtained during years, he progressively developed a new concept, the concept of the internal environment, which, in a sense, is linked to our modern concept of homeostasis. So it might be seen also as the very beginning of what would be after that cybernetic. So, and Canguilhem was especially interested in that because there is no equivalent in physics or chemistry of the concepts, which is proprement biologique, of the internal environment. And several colleagues, for instance, Jean Gallienne, before he died, Jean Gallienne was not a student of Canguilhem, because Canguilhem retired in 1971. But Jean Gallienne was able to go to the last classes that Canguilhem gave at the Sorbonne. And Canguilhem told me that for Canguilhem it was obvious that maybe the first true biological concept was the concept of internal milieu, and that, in a sense, history of biology started in the mid-19th century with the concept of internal milieu and the concept of naturalization. Then you have properly biological concept, and then something new is emerging, a true science, but that cannot be reduced to physics or chemistry. Is that clearer?
Yeah. Couldn't be more clear. Well, that was the first thing. The other thing is that intrigued me because you choose as a title "Vital Rationalist," and of course that what you explain in your own book is to deal with. It's called "La connaissance de la vie." And you said at the beginning that he took some distance both from the Cartesian mechanistic tradition and as well from Bergson and his conception of spiritual vitalism. And so what's for Canguilhem the importance of this concept of life? What is it, after all? I'm sorry, it's a bit...
Okay, this is a huge question. Thank you, it's very challenging. Well, Canguilhem was trained in the Lycée Henri IV in the very center of Paris, a few meters away from the Sorbonne. And he was trained as a pupil of Alain. So Alain was very, very famous during the interwar period. Maybe one of the two most famous philosophers with Bergson at that time. And he made the First World War, and then he became completely disgusted with all that is interaction with military. So he was a strong pacifist, and Canguilhem followed in its footsteps. So this to say that Canguilhem was trained in, with neo-Kantian philosophers. So the issue of the foundation of knowledge was to him a major concern, what is called in philosophy theory of knowledge, theory like connaissance. So since the very beginning, Canguilhem thought of what could be the basis of knowledge. What is knowledge, and what is knowledge for? And of course, knowledge only exists in connection with life. So the very origin of his interest in life was directly a consequence of his training as a neo-Kantian philosopher. Usually, I don't know how to say that in English, but the traditional philosophical issue is about le sujet connaissant. How would you translate it?
Sujeito cognoscente.
Okay, so this is a very classical issue in philosophy. And at the start, Canguilhem was exactly there. But then, progressively in the 30s, because he read again Bergson, at the beginning he was very angry against Bergson, but like everyone of his generation. But then he read Bergson and thought that maybe there are more in Bergson than what is usually said. He started his medical training in 36 at Toulouse, and he transformed the traditional issue of philosophy du sujet connaissant in the sujet vivant, the alive subject. I don't know exactly.
Sujeito vivant.
Okay.
Sujeito cognoscente.
And because of that, life was at the very center of his philosophical research program, because in order to understand what is knowledge, you have to understand what is life. And the cover of the book, it's a very small unicell organism in Namibia. This living being for Canguilhem was especially important. And he referred to that in several places, already in the normal and the pathological, because for Canguilhem, Namibia is already something that is able to perform knowledge. To perform knowledge of what? Knowledge of its direct environment. So for Canguilhem, there was a kind of equivalence between knowledge and life. And the title of the book is already about that. The knowledge of life. In French, it could be understood in two ways. Life as the subject of knowledge, and life as the object of knowledge. And of course, Canguilhem meant both at the same time. So, I'm not sure I have answered to the entirety of your question, because the question is very large, but if there is a core in Canguilhem's philosophy, it is this: the connection, the strong connection, almost an equivalence between knowledge and life. And this is a huge difference with Gaston Bachelard and Michel Foucault. Gaston Bachelard was never interested in why we know, what is the origin of knowledge, why living beings, or at least humans, are able to produce knowledge. Gaston Bachelard was interested in understanding how we arrived at modern physics. And the same could be said for Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was not so much interested in the kind of theory de la connaissance. And this is a very specific, because usually they are seen as the three musketeers of French historical epistemology: Bachelard, Canguilhem, and Foucault. But there are huge differences between them. Of course, there are common points, but there are also huge differences. And this difference, I guess, might be the more central in order to better understand the very specificity of Canguilhem or philosophical project.
That's for sure, yeah. And what I like about this that you said is that anyway, the concept of life is not a philosophical concept in the traditional sense. He's redefining it. Yeah. So that's more than enough to put the separation between him and Bergson. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because in Bergson, life is a concept like any other. So it's a philosophical concept in the traditional sense, right? Canguilhem is doing something new.
He's doing something new, and is coming 40 years after Bergson. So a very important thing to understand also is that biology experienced very important transformation between the time of Bergson, because Bergson published his book in 1907, but basically his biological information came from before that, the late 19th century. So at a time when genetics did not yet exist, when Darwinism was experienced a complete eclipse in evolutionary theories. And Canguilhem started to think of that in the 40s and the 50s, at the time of the rise of the modern synthesis, and at the time of the emergence of molecular biology. So his understanding is completely different from what Bergson was able to do almost half a century before that.
Thank you. So, if you have any questions.
Thank you very much for the comments, for taking time.
No, because the book is really good, and it's easy to read in the sense that you have already stated. Because when you open Canguilhem,
yeah,
for example, the normal or the pathologic, which is perhaps the most difficult of them all. You read a sentence and you have 3 pages of commentary to make on a single sentence. So it's very dense, and you perform a small miracle of making it all very accessible. So I recommend heartily.
Okay, thank you.
So
it was a challenge to make Canguilhem understandable for average people.
It's very difficult to do that, and I think I was very pleased with the book. And so. Então, se vocês tiverem questão, pode ser em português, em inglês.
So, question. When you consider your image of the circles,
yeah,
how do you think about the circles proposed by Canguilhem?
Sorry, I will make it. Sorry. Okay. Well.
So I guess.
But it's only to make an image of our mind. If you consider the idea that you have a strong superposition of life and science.
Yes.
And considering that the knowledge is based on the life idea, I understood the idea that you have two concepts of life. But considering that the mechanical science and life is superposed, the idea of knowledge, and I have two real questions. One is, it's possible to consider that the technology is possible in a machine, or it's described as a mechanical aspect, or on the other hand, if it's a so special machine that what you have on the life, the machines that are proposed by life, the bodies and the brains or something like that. And the knowledge is something that is not part of the machine. You understood the two concepts of that? It's not clear for me how to solve the problem. That is, the knowledge is possible, described and produced in a machine, or in the other hand, if the knowledge is something that's not present in the machine, it's something more.
Go through the show.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly,
Or
yeah.
there is a third one.
Okay, so
Probably another one possibility that not only is true.
yeah, so I'm not sure to have understood you correctly, but I would say that for Canguilhem, the machine could produce knowledge if by knowledge you mean mechanical science. That would be something that I guess you would agree with. But I think you would disagree with the fact that the machine could produce something like biological knowledge for the reason that I tried to develop in my talk. But this is still, I suppose, an open question today, especially with the development of artificial intelligence. To what extent mechanical programs could produce new knowledge? We know that they are very useful to solve some mathematical problems in physics and chemistry, but in biology, it might be a little bit more open. And if it is obviously true that since the 60s, molecular biology, population genetics made tremendous progress, and that in a sense, classical mechanical science was able to understand a huge part of what is life. But yet, the fact that, for example, some people are trying to develop system biology and these kinds of new knowledge could also be interpreted as, in a sense, validating Canguilhem doubts about the fact that strictly mechanical science could give us the full knowledge of what is possible. I'm not sure to have answered precisely your question, but this would be the beginning of my answer.
Because the problem that I think is to consider that the knowledge is not possible to be made by a machine. And it's not be explainable in this analytical or reductive method.
Yeah.
That look like that the solution is that the knowledge is something ethereal or spiritual that's not present on the basis of that. That's the point. That it's, if it's possible, okay, but if it's not possible, what's the solution?
Okay.
Not to accept the idea.
This is a central issue, because Bergson would, of course, disagree that the knowledge could be mechanically produced by a machinist. And Canguilhem was in between. So I guess the the best way to understand him would be to say that his emphasis of what he called biological philosophy should be understood at the methodological level. But Canguilhem is not saying that maybe we will never attain some kind of full knowledge of life, but we have to be cautious and we have to pay attention of the vitality of the living. So he had no miracle recipe to propose. He was not. He did not want to enter the field of Bergsonism and the vital impulse. This was only verbal solution for him, and he was not able to see what concretely the vital impulse could be. But at the same time, he was satisfied with mechanical biology, because of course mechanical biology is solving issues, but still we have to face the vitality of the living. So we have to be cautious of that. And his philosophical concept of the normativity of living beings is not was not formed to become a scientific concept. It was a philosophical concept in order to say to biologists, okay, pay attention to the to vital phenomena that could not be easily reduced to mechanical phenomena. But maybe in the future, in the distant future, it will be the case. But for now, we should not be that simplistic. And remember the biologists that I mentioned. Sorry again. I don't remember. Yeah, this one. They were very simplistic. If you know the history of biology, in the first three decades of the century, you can find very simplistic assumptions about, for instance, what is human thought, what is the brain, and what is evolution, something very mechanical, which is only about physical forces and the inheritance of our characters. And you cannot understand Canguilhem's positions if you are not aware of the fact that he reacted to that in order to say to biologists, okay, science is necessarily analytical and mechanical, but at the same time, living beings are individual entities in the sense of integrated wholes, and you have to pay attention to that. So I would say that he would be very critical against some reductionist stances of modern molecular biology, and very interested in, for instance, systems biology and this kind of emerging disciplines.
I think Pedro Paulo wants to comment.
I have something, just small points to answer that before.
You can add.
Because there is also in La Connaissance de la Vie, the knowledge of life, a chapter on machine and organism, where Canguilhem explains that, or he tells us not to forget that machines are products of biological intentionality.
Yeah.
So in a sense, when we attribute intelligence to machines, they are sorts of biological functions as well. He invites us to think along those lines. So that's interesting as well.
Canguilhem, like several others, thought that machines and techniques were, in a sense, the extended phenotype of living beings, that they are projections of the way organs are producing functions.
And they interact with
outside the body. Yeah. He was very interested in the philosophy of techniques and the history of techniques. And he read about German philosophy of techniques, and also Laurent Loison, which was very important at that time in French circles. So yes.
So that just adds to what you were saying.
I would ask you to, I would invite you to show us how would you put a circle, coming back to the circles.
Okay, which one? The green one of Canguilhem?
Where Canguilhem idea of how would you put the individuality or humanistic thinking in this model?
Okay, precisely, individuality was the core issue about biology. So what he wanted was not to himself produce biological concepts, and in this sense, he would be very critical, I guess, with regard to what we know as philosophy of biology. You know, many colleagues philosophers that are trying to produce biological concepts. This, for Canguilhem, was heresy, a term that he explicitly used to qualify philosophers that are willing to produce biology. What was his intention was to make biologists aware of the fact that, at the very least, biology should be constructs of the obvious fact that biological phenomena are consequences of biological entities, living organisms. And this should be the beginning of biology. And biology could not escape this reality. And because of that, he had an understanding of natural selection which was not populational, which was very typological. So I guess he knew almost nothing about population genetics, and he would have been critical of some aspect of population genetics because of that. Because in population genetics, what is important, causally relevant, is not individuals, but only Mendelian populations of animals that are subject to various evolutionary forces, natural selection, drift, migration, etc. So, because of this, Canguilhem would be, I guess, critical against population genetics. But again, he was more connected to German physiology and philosophy, and he knew not that much about English science and especially population genetics. So I guess this is an answer to your question. Neil?
So I think it really connects to this question, starting with Frazão's. I wonder how Canguilhem understood biological information. So when you talk about his fascination with the new terms in molecular biology, I wonder how he interpreted that. And that makes me even more curious because I cannot really get French at all. But when I was flipping your book, I saw a mention to wet school. So I wonder how much the concept of Umwelt played a role in his definition of life and how biological information would be organized as a internal process versus external variables in a very pre-cybernetic world, right? So I wonder what you talk about.
Okay, there are many questions in your question. So,
But Umwelt.
yes, about Umwelt, it was tremendously important for us. So, work school, there is a distinction which is two types of environment, Umwelt and Umwelt, and which is not possible in English because we have only one term, the environment, and usually environment seems to be something that is imposed from the outside to organism, and that has nothing to do with the activity of organism. And of course, as we know for centuries, organisms, it is obviously humans, are actively producing their environments. So this is why Canguilhem was especially interested in this conceptual distinction. And this was already the case very early in the 40s and 50s, and it is a central aspect of his text, Le vivant et son milieu, the knowledge of life. And after that, this is a very strange episode in his intellectual path. And for me, it is paradoxical. So I have no satisfactory explanation. I have an explanation, but it is a paradox because when he started to know about molecular biology, he completely embraced this, in a sense, conceptual understanding of life, with absolutely not anymore any connection to the milieu. Not anymore. Life, when we understood molecular biology, life was only about the DNA sequence that is ontologically genetic information, and we equated that with life. So here you have no relational understanding, no need of the Umwelt or anything else. It is a very reductionist understanding of life, and for me this is a difficulty in understanding Canguilhem. And this is the paradox that I talk about in my paper, because it is paradoxical to have in the 60s a very reductionist understanding of life, given that he basically opposed that previously. So my solution, it's a hypothesis, to this paradox is what I explained before, is that because he had that, he was able to equate knowledge and life. And this was a more important issue to him than the relational definition of life with regard to material. So Canguilhem thought that thanks to molecular biology, he would be able to solve the core issue, and in my reading, in my interpretation, he was ready to give up on the relational understanding of life that he patiently elaborated for two decades before that. But very quickly, this was around 66, from 66 to until the early 70s. What happened next? He read François Jacob's The Logic of Life, and in the conclusion of the book, François Jacob said quite explicitly that these terms are metaphorical, and that we cannot say that there is ontologically something that is genetic information within organism. And after he read François Jacob, Canguilhem never again talked about that. So my interpretation is that, okay, he understood that he was wrong, and that he abandoned this very strange understanding. So it is completely a mistake if you want to see the truth, and if you want to use these kind of terms. But what is interesting in this obvious error is that, in my interpretation again, it's an argument in order to, it's a proof that what was the most important to him was that, and that he was ready to give up the idea that a living being has to be defined in connection with its environment, which was a huge step. But it was for only a few years, and already in 1973, you have very standard understanding of what is life, when, for instance, he published a very important article in the French encyclopedia. The title of the article was Life, and in this very article, you cannot find anything in connection with the concepts.
From which year is this so?
73.
Okay.
In the French encyclopedia.
Okay.
But it's not obviously a mistake. I mean, you can argue that all possible unvelds are contained into the genetic code. That could be argued.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Well, nonetheless, it would be very difficult to argue that in a convincing way. But
Really? I mean, it's a product of many years, many trials of interpreting the world, and that's what worked so far.
okay, but you have to think of the genome as a complete memory of the species. So
Yeah,
yeah,
It's a bit different.
okay,
well, I mean, it's possible.
okay.
I'm not saying I agree with that.
Yeah.
It's possible.
If I may add, it is also possible, since that life is a language, in a sense, when François Jacob says that everything, all this manner of speaking metaphors, well, language of metaphor.
Yeah, but he was,
See what I'm
yeah,
getting
yeah,
at.
but Canguilhem was looking for something more than just metaphor.
Yeah, yeah.
And there is what François Jacob is saying in his book, Philosophy of Life, and there is
Just a footnote.
yeah,
Esse livro do François Jacob, quem não sabe, tem em português. A lógica da
what was it translated into Portuguese?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so perfect. And Michel Foucault published a review of François Jacob's book, and I guess even more than the direct reading of François Jacob, what was important for Canguilhem was the review of Foucault that was published in the Le Monde. And we had the reading notes of François Jacob, of Canguilhem at the cafes. And so we had a very complete knowledge of what he thought is important in the book published by Jacob. And this is in the paper that I mentioned previously.
Thank you, personally, for the lecture. I wanted to stress a little bit more the idea of organism and individual, especially.
Yeah.
As you asked, and I was thinking a little bit about it, because as a biologist, it was a little bit easier for me to understand the idea of the individual, especially if you have as a model a mammal or the human.
Okay.
And then I went to anthropology, and it started to become a little bit more difficult to define an individual, like especially in the last few weeks, in which I have been reading Latour and Jean Ingold and other authors. And in a way, if you were talking about the idea of milieu, and that there is environment inside and outside the organism, the individual, and at the same time, if the vital processes happens within the cell, and we have a lot of cells that could define an individual, and then where it is, like where can you say that the individual starts and it ends, and to Canguilhem, what would exactly be one?
Okay, this is a very good question. And one chapter of knowledge of life is in a sense devoted to that question, because Canguilhem is known also as a historian of biology, but before he became professor of history at science at the Sorbonne, which was only in 55, he was already in his 50s, so it was late. And before that, he published only one single paper in history of science, which was in the knowledge of life. It is a very long, dense paper about the history of cell theory. So Canguilhem had exactly the question in mind that you just asked about, okay, but if cells are individuals, what do we have levels of individuality? And here I am interpreting, okay, so I guess his answer would be that an individual is when you have something that is structured by an internal milieu, and this, maybe I can explain. Let's just join. So here you have an entity with a milieu interior, and this entity organized very actively its milieu exterior. So in this sense, cells within the body are not organisms, because they are parts of bigger world, and it is this upper level of individuality which is actively organized outside environment. So if I understood Canguilhem correctly, this might be an answer to your questions, but it fully acknowledges the difficulty of understanding at which level in biological systems could we ascribe individuality. And this was, I guess, his main motivation in writing his paper on the history of cell theory. He was not at all interested in historiographical issues. He was indeed very bad in looking for archives or reading directly primary sources. When he was in Strasbourg, he had a very close colleague, Marc Klein. He was a very good cell biologist, And in 1936, Marquelin published a whole book on the history of self-help. And basically what Canguilhem did was, okay, he read Marquelin's book, and then as a philosopher, not as a historian, he tried to elaborate, okay, what can we learn about political individuality, knowing the history of the concept of the self and the history of self-help. So this would be my answer to your question.
This brings me to another question. You mentioned that he was not interested in the history of self.
Not directly.
Self,
Yeah.
But so I would like to ask you about his thoughts in historiography. Many, for instance, I'm remembering of his critics to the concept of precursor.
No.
That is very important for us historians of science. We always use Canguilhem's word as maybe the first time that someone problematized the word and expanded with that critics. He expanded the corpus of analysis of any history of particular history of science. So I would like you to.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for your question. This part of Canguilhem's work has nothing to do with knowledge of life and with the chapter on the history of self-theory, because indeed in this chapter he was looking for precursors of self-theory. So it is very strange when you know what is supposed to be the framework of historical epistemology. Basically what happened is that Canguilhem was not a historian of science. Then he knew that Bachelard was about to retire, and very quickly, because he was only, he had a PhD in medicine but not in philosophy, so he worked on his PhD very quickly, and I skip many very funny episodes, but in the end, he defended a PhD about the history of the concept of reflex in 1955, and a few weeks after that, he was recruited when Bachelard retired. And it is only because he became a professor of history of science that he started to be interested in this intellectual activity. Okay, what is history of science? How do we have to perform history of science? So, from 1955 until 1971, it was the period when he developed all these methodological principles about the good way to perform history of science. And it was during this period, and in this context, that he decided to distinguish between the history of science that is done by scientists and what history of science should be. And the most obvious way of performing history of science for scientists is to look for precursors. Okay, so now we have this state of knowledge. When did it begin in the past? We have that, and we can come back to this, etc., etc. And for Canguilhem, this was a very bad way to do history of science, because in doing that, you are looking at the past only with the eye of the present. And it is like if you have a kind of theoretical explanation, and scientific knowledge would be only progressing like an embryo is developing in order to give the adult phenotype. So one of the very first things that he elaborated during this period was a critical examination of the concept of precursor. And, but there were other concepts that he developed at that time. One of those was the one of scientific ideology, in order to understand, okay, at some point in the course of history you have a new science, but before that, what do you have? And for Canguilhem, the answer was not nothing. Before science, you always have something that tries to mimic science and is necessary for science to become. But this something is not yet science, and it's not anti-science at the same time. It's something in between that he turned scientific ideology. So what is remarkable was his will to develop the epistemology of history of science, what is called nowadays philosophy of historiography. And in my view, it is still hardly needed today because we are, as historians of science, most of the time performing history of science with no methodological principles. And what is basically the international methodology is empiricism. Okay, I'm looking for sources in order to produce narrative. Okay, but what for? Why? And how are you organizing all these sources in order to produce a narrative? And usually, historians of science, they cannot answer that question. They are doing empirical work, and this is obvious in the US. Because in the US, you have philosophers on the one side and historians, and they are not at all in the same department, they are not talking to each other. And the divide between the context of discovery and the context of justification is very strong. So, in my view, Canguilhem is still needed in order to understand how to perform history of science and why we are doing this activity. I hardly recommend the reading of some papers by Canguilhem, but unfortunately, they are even harder to understand than knowledge of life. But they are full of very stimulating propositions. And again, the philosophy of historiography in history of science has never been done. So there is a completely full new era of research in order to produce that. And what has happened in the 80s and 90s is that basically when historians of history of science became a truly academic professional activity, most historians of science simply incorporated empiricism and the concepts of science studies in order to have a minimal framework to do history of science. But as far as I'm concerned, this is not at all satisfactory. Sorry for the long answer.
Contextualized history?
Sorry?
Would you call this moment in the 80s and 90s the contextualized history of science?
Yes, in a sense, and during this period, historians of science tried to avoid the triumphalistic history of science that was sometimes done by scientists or philosophers, and they tried to go the other way around, to be very empirically minded. And this is what I was saying during my talk a few days ago when I said that historians of science are trying to avoid the present because they want to be only contemporaries of the actors. But in my view, this is absolutely not satisfactory because we are speaking from the present. And for a narrative to exist, you need perspective. And, okay, this would be my answer.
And maybe I ask something else. What do you think about that idea that he mentioned that the effects of the idea of the device made between history of science as a history of, I have to remember the words,
The
history of the past,
Yeah.
or the past of.
Okay. This is another play word by Canguilhem.
Yeah.
So, is the past of science okay, so what was this sentence again?
History of science is the science in
In
the
the
past.
past, okay. So, this again, maybe
Or
it would
the
be
past of the science.
Yes.
Science or
Is it the same? Okay. So imagine that you have a science, for instance, evolutionary theory. Okay? This is the present, and you are looking for the past of this theory. So for Canguilhem, it is problematic if you reduce the past of the present to only what was termed during the past evolutionary theory. Okay, this you will have, of course, Darwin at some point, but you will maybe you can include Lamarck also, etc. Okay, but for Canguilhem, the idea is that the past of the present science is much bigger than this science in the past. So it is terminology, because you have to include other regions of knowledge that were not included in evolutionary thinking, but are nonetheless necessary in order to understand how the present progressively emerged from that. So this was another methodological principle. And again, this is why in the end he proposed the idea of scientific ideology in order to make some room for what was not directly connected to the present, but nonetheless is tremendously important in order to understand the present. Just to give you one example, when you produce his narrative about the history of cell biology, he included in this narrative Newtonianism and the theory of light by Newton, because this theory was making a distinction between a particulate understanding of matter and a continuous understanding of matter. And this, for Canguilhem, was the very beginning of cell theory. And in his reading, he thought that Newton was, in a sense, important for Buffon, and that you can have a Newtonian reading of Buffon's theory of the molecules organic, and that Buffon's theory on molecular organic was an ancestor of the cell theory that emerged in the 30s in the German-speaking world. So this was already an illustration of this idea that we cannot reduce the past of a scientific theory to the same scientific theory in the past.
I would have a question that connects with this and the question of the one who knows it and the subject of knowledge is the place of reflexivity in biological sciences, right? Because you said there is this ambiguity, la connaissance de la vie, it's the life as an object, or the life as knowing. And usually we take this take, perhaps Pedro Paulo will have also comment on this, like, well, reflexivity is for human sciences and the separability on the knower and the object is for natural science, of course. After quantum physics, no one thinks as this, but this was the classical thing. And it seems to me that reflexivity brings biological science to a middle position in some sense between human sciences and natural sciences with having reflexivity. Does Canguilhem talks anything about this, and what do you know about what do you think about this? Because we are talking like Newton to Buffon and things like this. Of course, there are a lot of structural things that are shared by biology and other neuroscience, but reflexivity, the fact that we are living beings investigating life, is a crucial matter, right? Does Canguilhem give any attention to this?
Okay, this is tremendously important again, and he was trained as a young philosopher in what was called l'école de la réflexivité around Alain. So all these philosophers were continuously thinking about those topics in the 20s and 30s. But again, I'm not a philosopher by training, so to some extent, I think maybe sometimes I'm missing something. So yes, it was important for Canguilhem, and yes, it was there since the very beginning of his training as a philosopher. And I'm not aware of precise text where Canguilhem would have explained himself precisely about this, because it was very in his early writings you can find many instances of that, but this should be a question for Camille Limoges, who is editing the Œuvre Complète. He was himself a student of Canguilhem, defended his PhD. He is a Canadian philosopher, and he defended his PhD at the Sorbonne in May '68. So very, very dramatic environment. And perfectly, he knows everything about every paper. So maybe this should be asked
Great.
to converge.
From a factor point of view, right? Because at
Yeah.
a structural point of view,
Yeah.
it should be considered.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Do
yeah.
you agree, right? We cannot avoid this question, right?
Yeah. But I will ask Camille Mosh and I will tell you the
Okay.
answer that he will give to me. But of course, it's a very important aspect. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excuse me for bringing you back to individuality in the environment. But does he discuss the idea of activity, or does he just assumes that?
No. It was activity and creation. What is creation was a central aspect of his reflection. And as I mentioned before, in a complete emergency, he defended a PhD on the history of the concept of reflex. But thanks to the work of Camille Mosh, we know now that he was thinking of a much bigger dissertation that would have been devoted to the problem of creation in general and for life especially. And his two first papers as a philosopher that were not papers of vulgarization or dissemination. The first was published in 1937 and it was about René Descartes and the issue of technique. And the second, 1 year later in 1938, was about precisely that problem, the issue of creation. What is creation? And to him, life was about true creation of new forms, of how to organize the environment. So, and creation necessarily implies activity. So he always thought as activity as a central aspect for life and for knowledge. Knowledge is a positive activity of the mind, and he was completely opposed to empiricism, to the fact that knowledge would be only the imprinting of what we can feel thanks to our senses in our brain. So he was completely opposed to behavioralism and all these kind of new philosophy that emerged at that time. So yes, activity was important to him. It was a central aspect of his philosophy, but because of life contingencies, he did not do the PhD that he was willing to do about creation and activity. So it's both very central, but also it is something that is hidden in various publications, and you have to reconstruct what he was precisely thinking about that. So this would be a fantastic PhD dissertation to have a complete examination of what Canguilhem thought about when he was talking about activity and creation.
And was he aware of neuroscience and genetics?
Yes, he had some knowledge in both. But do you have a more precise question, maybe?
I'm not trained in biology, I'm trained in philosophy,
Okay.
but I'm reading Eric Kandel's autobiography,
Yeah.
and it seems there's a lot of genetic determinations in the processing of knowledge.
Okay.
From molecular biology.
Yeah, but this was too late for Canguilhem. Canguilhem retired in 1971. After that, he remained philosophically active during years, but of course his level of work diminished. So in the 50s and 60s, when he was at the peak of his career, he did not, as far as I know, he did not go into this kind of emerging of knowledge. And yes, what is very important also is that he was especially close to biology in the late 30s and early 40s when he was a PhD student in medicine. So already in the 50s and 60s, what he knew about biology and medicine was already a little bit outdated. So he was a good specialist of the 30s and 40s, but after that, it became too difficult for him to be in touch with modern science, and this was obvious with molecular biology.
The idea of real and of choice,
Yeah.
are these ideas present?
Sorry, could
The
you-
idea of real,
Yes,
and of choice, of free choice.
yes.
Does he discuss that when he works over creation and
Well,
activity of
not that, yeah, yes, in a sense it was something important in his way, but he did not elaborate that much on these classical philosophical issues. But for instance, to him, history of science was not developing linearly something that would have been virtually present from the beginning. It was about individual choices made by scientists that could have been maybe different, at least to some extent. So in his epistemology, the concept of choice, of personal choice, was important, but he did not, unfortunately, elaborate much on that topic, as far as I know.
I think Pedro Paulo wants to. No. We are reaching time, yes, of course.
Vous avez dit que les cellules n'est pas une diversité, non?
Yes, if they are part of a bigger organism, yes.
À la fin de le milieu et le vivant au milieu, Canguilhem a dit que les cellules ont un verre. Et si les cellules ont un verre, donc il a une individualité.
Of course, so this is a very difficult issue in his understanding. So, of course, he knew that to some degree there is a level of individuality with cells. Okay, so he perfectly acknowledge that some organisms, unicellular organisms, are true individual bodies. But his idea is that the level of individuality of the whole of a multicellular organism is something more important, something more real than the degree of individuality of the cells within the organism. But this was a difficulty for Canguilhem, and I guess it's still today an issue for biologists to what extent cells in a body could be said to be individual. So I'm not saying that it was that simple, but it was the way that he tried to limit this difficulty in his biological philosophy.
Final question. Otherwise, let us thank once more Laurent and Pedro Paulo Pimenta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. It was very stimulating for me, and I hope you enjoy that as much as I do. Do not hesitate to buy my book; it's very cheap.
The problem is to bring it here. I'm not sure if I don't say that it exists. No, not anymore. The problem is the text is so heavy, the Hebrew, you know.
No, you guys are going to buy this.